welcome to the Two Real Cinema Club. I'm James Rosica.
And I'm Andres Lorente. And on the Two Real Cinema Club, every other week or so, we watch a couple of films, and usually one is new and one is old, and we talk about them. We make some comparisons between the two. Lately, we've talked about them a lot. I think we hit 90 minutes last week. Is that right? An hour and a half.
Yes, almost as long as half of Avatar Way of Water, yes.
I felt like we really were sort of channeling Cameron. I feel like I've been in the abyss, and I told you before, I actually went back and watched probably 30 minutes of special features on the DVD, which finally came from the library. So I still have like half a foot, 1 foot in the ocean, and I'm just coming to the surface now.
Oh, taking a deep breath.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Let's do the socials. You can find us on Twitter at Two Real Cine Club at twitter.com. We're on Instagram at Two Real Cinema Club at instagram.com. You can read our blog at tworealcinemaclub.com. That's probably the first place to go if you want to harangue us. Or you can email us at tworealcinemaclub at gmail.com. Please, if you're enjoying the show, tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell passers-by on the street. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you or they get your podcasts, and YouTube as well. So there's no excuse. This week, we have, there's going to be a whole bunch of, or we have a feast for you, a smorgasbord of entertainment. What are we watching this week?
We are watching The Menu, which just came out, I think, end of 2022. So it's fresh and less fresh, but equally good. Babette's Feast, which I think is 1987, I want to say.
Yeah, 87.
So this is a good spread here of about, what, 25 plus 13, 22 plus 13, 30? Is that 35 years?
35 years.
35 years.
That's long enough to make a really, really good cheese, isn't it?
Yeah, ooh. It's a good vintage, is that what it is? Yes. The mold.
So you're doing The Menu. Why don't you tell me what the story is?
I'd be happy to. Give you a little background first. It's a $35 million film. It's already made double that last I checked. And it's already on, I think it's Netflix here. Is it on a streaming service with you?
It's Disney Plus in the UK, okay. Which feels like a bit of a strange bedfellow for this movie. But they're the people who've ended up with it here.
It does. So for me, it's sort of like it's proving that these new models can work, because I think it had certainly a release. I saw it in the theaters here, or I saw it arrive in probably November, December. I just saw it about 2 weeks ago, I think, in the theater. So it's still in the theater here in Portland. But I've noticed right after that, I could have stayed at home and watched it on Netflix. But I was happier to see it on a big screen, honestly. And it's an hour and 47 minutes. You don't need that pee break. It's like the perfect length film.
Yes.
I liked that a lot. I think both of these films are actually considerably shorter. They're about the same length, Babette's Feast and The Menu, compared to. So we watched probably half as much. No wonder the weeks went by so quickly. I felt like I had free time.
That's where my energy has come from this week.
Yeah, it was about half as much as watching Avatar and The Abyss. So what I consider like a perfect length. That's fantastic for this kind of film. Written by Seth Weiss, who comes from the satirical American newspaper called The Onion. They bill themselves as America's finest news source. He's also done late night television for Seth Meyers, who's one of these late night sort of talk show hosts here in the States. And the other writer is Will Tracy, who writes, oddly enough, he also writes for a talk show here. For John Oliver, who has an HBO show. So, John Oliver's an Englishman who's come over here and found a lot of success, and Will Tracy is one of his writers. But Will Tracy also writes for Succession. So this sort of comes out of Succession, which is an excellent HBO series. I think you probably have it there.
I think it might be on Apple TV in this country.
It's so strange.
Which is the one streaming service that nobody has, I think. So we don't have it in this house. I think it is available somewhere in the
UK. Lots of English connections there, because Jesse Armstrong, who did Peep Show and In the Loop, is really the creator and one of the major writers on Succession, which I love. We watch it religiously. We're very much looking forward to the upcoming season. And let's see, Mark Millard, who's sort of one of the chief directors now. He's sort of become the go-to director for Succession. He did stints with Shameless in the UK, I believe, and Game of Thrones. Yeah. But I think this is his feature debut in the film world, which is...
Well, I read that he he directed Ali G in the House, which was a UK feature film spin-off of the Ali G TV series. So I think isn't necessarily his first feature, but maybe it's his first proper feature.
Yeah, I don't remember seeing that. Either I didn't see that as a feature film when I saw it on IMDb, or maybe it didn't come up. I don't know if that was ever released in the States, to be honest. I only saw Ali G when I lived in England. And someone else to mention is Malad's wife, Amy Westcott, who does an amazing costume design on this film, part of the art direction department. I thought costumes were really good, so I wanted to mention her as well. And apparently Will Tracy pitched this to Malad when they were working on Succession, and I guess it's based on Will Tracy had vacationed in Norway and ate on an island. And he realized he was trapped until the end of the meal, and then his imagination went wild. So it's just, I think the great source material is you're having a meal on some remote island in Norway, not far from where we'll be in our second film. It's already a connection there. But the story is basically 12 clients are paying about $1,000 a piece to arrive on this remote island. It's got these beaches that are just littered with driftwood that look like dead bodies, and I think it's very foreboding, and it's just some of those early images really set the film up beautifully. They're there to visit a restaurant run by superstar chef Slowick, played by Ray Fiennes, and he lives there with his entire staff in this very austere and disciplined work camp, really. It feels more like a camp than a restaurant. Nicholas Hoult plays Tyler. And I didn't realize until later he was the young boy from the film About a Boy. I knew I recognized him. Yeah.
I didn't know that. The only thing I remembered him from is from Mad Max Fury Road.
Oh, okay. I remembered him as a kid. I kept thinking, he's one of those moments where I'm thinking, who is that? I've seen him before. I've seen him 20 years ago when he was a child. He plays a character named Tyler who brings Margot, who's played by Anya Taylor-Joy. And she's an unexpected guest. This is a very well-organized restaurant, so they're expecting certain people. They've got their names. They've done some background history on them. And Margot is unexpected. And this clearly is not going to be a typical meal delivered from Chef Slowick, who says to his elite customers, "We are a nanosecond. Nature is timeless." It's very sort of sermon-like or preacher-like chef. He's worshipped for sure, so his words are quite high. There's a lot of high-minded language in this film, which is lovely. And we sort of know things that are going to go haywire when the diners they're not fed bread early on, which is wonderful, but instead they get a sermon about bread. It's the food of the common man, and that these people are not common. They've paid $1,200 a piece to sit down and eat his food. When the maitre d' Elsa intimates that the guests will eat less than they desire and more than they deserve, we know this film is not going to end well. But that's the beauty of the film and the delightful nature of it. So through his artful cooking, Slowick exposes the crimes and transgressions of his guests. They are sort of a band of corporate evildoers, film actors with no standards. Those are hard to find, I suppose, or philanderers, but he can't figure out Margot because they don't know anything about her. And he thinks she's a giver, whereas all these other people are takers. So she definitely stands out from the other guests, and she's not eating the food, really. So he's there to punish them, but Margot sort of represents this problem that he can't solve just because he doesn't know who she is. The male diners realize that all the diners realize that they're under threat. They're stuck there, and the male diners are allowed to sort of make an attempt at an escape, which doesn't go particularly well. The women take that moment to have this sort of awkward bonding moment over some food. Not long before Margot is put in this position to battle Elsa. Elsa's this kind of very stern, but also very almost violent, menacing kind of maitre d'. And they're in this sort of kitchen full of deadly utensils. There's this incredibly long, I think it was a boning knife. I don't know my knives that well, but that comes in handy. And it's never good when there's a very long boning knife involved. I don't think.
It's Chekhov's boning knife, isn't it? Yes.
Tyler, that's Margot's date, the guy who brought her on this journey. His fault is simply being a sycophant. he begins as a sycophant, and despite his knowledge and his like photographic library of great food, he's basically only learned to take pictures and brag about the great food he's eaten. So everyone has their sort of idiosyncrasy that offends Chef Slowick. He takes a particular, and we don't know why he takes a particularly disliking for Tyler, and he forces Tyler to cook, and ends up creating something that the chef calls Tyler's bullshit, and he must be punished. And one thing I loved about the film is you sort of see these images of the food, and they with on-screen text, they tell you what the food is, what the name of the dish is, what it includes for ingredients, and Tyler's bullshit is no exception. They give him the treatment as well. I should mention that I'm a pescatarian, and the menu is definitely a film for those who like their meals on the bloody side.
Yeah.
Having disclosed that, I loved the red meat whimsically served up in the film, and the nods to the cooking shows. I loved that, just with these images and dish names and ingredients. I thought that was a really nice touch, given that a lot of these reality cooking shows are huge here in the States right now. The chef's lament is basically that he sort of tasked himself with satisfying this ilk of people who are absolutely impossible to satisfy. Ultimately, Margot challenges him to serve a simple cheeseburger because she's hungry, given the nature of what has been served, which is very little food, honestly. And the cheeseburger ends up being a savior of sorts in this film. And we'll get into some of the details, I think, later. But I think I looked at your show notes, and I think you're going to make a call to the Cliche Squad. I have it down here that I'm not really, but I know what you're going to say, and it's exactly what I predicted that you might what you might say. So I don't know if we want to start with a cliche or if you want to save that for later. But I have lots of thoughts, but I want to hear what you have to say about the film first.
I'm gonna withhold my Cliche Squad call.
Nice.
Yeah, for another 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay.
The film gets a brief respite. I didn't know very much about this film going into it, and judging by the poster that I'd seen locally and the thumbnail that's on the streaming service, I was expecting a kind of horror film with a bit of a satirical edge.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's what it is. If I had to put a stamp on this film, I would call it a comedy. It's a very, very black comedy.
Yeah.
But it didn't surprise me to learn that the writers are people who've come up through the kind of the talk show, The Onion, the kind of the comedy writing circuit, because it's a comedy.
Yeah.
And I did laugh out loud a few times during the film. Most notably, the scene that you talked about earlier on, where Rafe finds, he tells the diners pretty early on, it's not much of a spoiler, he kind of says, well, we're all going to die tonight.
Yeah.
But he gives the men in the party this chance to run away. Even the character who's had a finger cut off, who spends most of the film sitting in a corner feeling sorry for himself, he mumbles something to his wife about, I'll send help, and then kind of limps away towards the camera. And that did summon a genuine chuckle. But I didn't laugh a lot. And I think if a film is going to be a comedy, I would like to have 3 or 4 good laughs in the film. And I don't think it does quite reach that threshold. It's amusing and it's satirical. And it was quite funny. I think I only laughed out loud the one time.
Oh, okay.
But did you think it was funny? Did you think it needed to be funny?
I think it was funny enough. I saw it with my wife and stepson, and we laughed a lot. But I did notice that I think we were the loudest laughers and the only ones who laughed more than probably 10 or 15 times. So I think it really appealed to our sense of humor, I think, and black comedy, and I think we really did enjoy it. So I did see it as a comic horror film. And it's by no means the cliche standard horror film. And I think that's why I liked it so much. It was just very black humor that I think had very, very real objectives. I think there's some statements that they're trying to really convey to the viewers. And I think it came out really well in that regard. I
mean, I am slightly scratching my head at the end because I feel like the film does feel like it's trying to say something in a loud and clear voice, but I'm not utterly sure what the thing it's trying to say is. I mean, I appreciate that it's commenting satirically on the kind of cultish aura that surrounds celebrity chefs, and even recently there have been in the news stories about real life bullying and real life drama for people working for famous chefs. So I can clearly believe that the food service industry is hell, and I can clearly believe that there is a kind of cultish aura around these kind of famous chefs. But I think if you wanted to make a film about a cult surrounding a chef, this isn't necessarily the right film or the right story to do it with. And is it kind of saying? Is it saying that this kind of haute cuisine, is all a bit of a sham and it will never beat a good cheeseburger? Is it saying that high-end restaurants are all kind of just dumb and stupid? Because the film both sort of respects this haute cuisine and hates it at the same time. So I came away not entirely sure whether the film had the attitude that restaurants like this should be torn down or whether they should be celebrated.
Yeah, I get that. I think you've got a good point there. For me, I think if it were, as you said, sort of more comic, I think it probably would have parodied the industry and the cooking show fad a lot better. But I think it ends up being much more about the wealthy who can afford a meal like that and the working class who actually have to prepare it. And it's true that we've got a lot of restaurants here that are not operating at full staff because they can't get people to go in there and stand for 8 and 12 hours a day in the kitchen, which is a very hot place at a livable salary, but not really one where you can save. So that there's that dynamic of very well-to-do diners sitting in these beautiful rooms, but underpaid staff, overworked staff, miserable staff actually creating the meals. So for me, it's much more about class than it is just roasting celebrity chefs and their shows, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, I do. I see what you mean about that notion about being unable to staff restaurants. I mean, this is a whole kind of post-pandemic phenomenon, isn't it? That people have kind of suddenly realised that you don't need to work these dumb, terrible jobs for minimum wage because, actually it's possible to survive without them. And, it's a bit of a kind of positive sea change for society as a whole. Aside from my kind of confusion about exactly what the film wants to say, I also kind of came away from it feeling like there are enough elements of the story that don't quite add up for it to impair my enjoyment. I'm sorry to kind of come down on this film because I did enjoy it, and there's a lot of craft here.
Yeah.
A lot of great performances, beautiful photography. There's lots of great stuff to enjoy, but I did spend some of my time watching the film asking myself, why is this happening? Why is that happening? The guests have all been told they're going to be killed, and once the first death occurs, clearly it must seem pretty serious, and yet somehow everybody seems to be hypnotized. Yeah. People don't really try and fight back. I mean, to the extent even that Ralph Fiennes' character tells all of the guests, none of you fought back. I thought you would fight back a little bit more than you did. You've disappointed me.
Yeah.
These people accept their fate so easily that even the film questions them, which is a kind of having your cake and eating it moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
They couldn't write the resistance, but they were aware that the resistance was absent, so commented on the script. There's this early moment when Tyler, who's the kind of the foodie, and Margot, who's his kind of supposedly his girlfriend, turn up, and it turns out that Margot's name is not the one that's on the reservation, and Tyler is extremely embarrassed, and and it's this kind of quite sort of nice bit of sort of social embarrassment where it looks like he's put his ex-girlfriend's name on the invitation, and then has he told the new girlfriend about the old girlfriend? How does she feel about it? Is she being replaced? How do you feel about going on the the holiday that your boyfriend booked with his ex-wife? And then later on in the film, about halfway through, it turns out that Tyler has just hired Margot for the evening to accompany him, in which case there's no reason for him to be embarrassed that her name isn't on the reservation. And he's paying for his services, and he has no reason to feel, sheepish.
Yeah.
So it feels a little bit like, the film again is having its cake and eating it, and there were enough of these moments that didn't quite meet together that left me feeling like the film was a hermetic whole. Didn't totally function as a plot, but also didn't totally function as a metaphor. And so it's kind of fallen between these two stools and hit the kitchen floor.
Yeah, for me, I didn't feel that. I definitely see what you're saying. In terms of Tyler, I mean, I think his fault is just that he will accept whatever the chef says and serves without any objection whatsoever. There's no reflection on whether it's good, actually really good food, or if it's nutritious or anything like that. It's more that he's just in love with the celebrity culture of it all, and he's just he's taking photos as if they're works of art, the food's works of art, and he'll do anything that the chef says, to a fault ultimately. And I think in terms of objections, I think it really kind of is a film about objections in the sense that I think we worship the wealthy and the famous so much that we don't really question the underlying system that makes them wealthy and famous. And I think that's what this film is about. So I think it's kind of appropriate that they don't object too much and they don't try and get away, because they just were in this habit of thinking, oh, well, if they're rich and famous, if they're powerful, then whatever they're doing is absolutely right. So we defer to whatever their actions are, not knowing fully what their motivations are, I think. So I think it makes sense, especially they're on an island. And it is you use the word hermetically. I mean, the whole place is kind of like hermetically sealed. There's bulletproof glass that we see at one point that just will not shatter. There's this great door that just sort of slides back into place. It's a swiveling door, and they really have no escape. And it's very ironic that the men are given this moment to escape, because they're definitely not going to escape. I see how that could be sort of a plot hole, and it might detract from the actual power of the film, but I think it's sort of all there for a purpose. I think that we don't have any objections. We don't seem to make any objections that are lasting or forceful about what puts these people in power, and why we listen to them in the first place. And the absolutely obsequious crew, the chef's assistants and the cooks following him, sort of underline that from the other side. I see the wealthy diners and the kitchen staff as being polar opposites, but they're all sort of I don't know, they're seconds, they're minions to these great leaders, these celebrity chefs, or I think one of the partners in the restaurant is what I could tell, maybe like a tech billionaire or something like that, and some of his employees and CEOs are at the dinner as well. So I think that's what it is. There's this sort of this duality between the rich and the poor that's pretty well illustrated here.
Speaking of the kind of the whole drama being hermetically sealed, I tell you what this film really wants to be, I think, is a play. I think if someone is clever, they would take this script and this scenario and turn it into a play, and it could be an absolutely storming play. It all happens in one place.
Yeah.
You have a relatively small cast. You could enjoy the contrast between the kitchen and the kind of the customers. Lots of clever stuff you could do with it on stage. You could even serve the audience these little amuse-bouche as they're waiting to go in. I mean, this would be a perfect play.
Yeah, I think
it's much better suited to theatre than it is to cinema.
I think I agree with you, and that did occur to me as well. Dare I say, possibly a musical as well. I think you could have some very funny songs about s'mores and amuse-bouche, and I think there could be a lot of great songs. But I'm not a musical fan myself, but I think this could be a very, very entertaining one. Yeah, I mean, it definitely, other than the ferry shots getting there, and a little bit of stuff that happens on the grounds of the island restaurant, most of it does take place between a kitchen and dining room, which is really just one space. And I think it's a beautiful space. I love the art direction on this film. I think all the filmmaking is just top notch. It's framed very beautifully, as I mentioned before. I think the set design, but also the costume design is like perfect. It really characterizes the students, the teacher talk there, students, characterizes the cast and the characters perfectly. So, I mean, I really love this film a lot. I mean, I think for me, the faults kind of fall along. I hated seeing the crew be so deferential to the chef, going along with this crazy plan around this meal. And I know the film sort of has to, given its setup, end with a great deal of violence and murder and such. But, I don't think it helps the revolutionary cause in the sense that, what is the working class always going to be a violent mob as opposed to like this thinking body that can actually make change. So that was one thing that bothered me quite a bit. I think they were just all way too subservient to chef.
I mean, maybe we'll talk about this after we talk about Babette's Feast, but it feels very much to me like a film about food in the age of late-stage capitalism. This film, it's a divided world, isn't it? There's a clear line between the rich and the poor, those who have and those who give it to them. That's all that it's about. I know you alluded to this earlier. I'm going to do it now. I think.
Go for it.
Even though you enjoyed the film, I am going to put in a call to the Cliche Squad.
Cliche Squad.
And my complaint is a simple one, which is that how often do we have to see a Hollywood film where the main character or the main character who is a young woman is a sex worker? Margot could have had all sorts of different jobs. She doesn't have to be a sex worker. So to have this revelation that she's a girlfriend for hire just feels like a really kind of a pretty cheap and unpleasant cliche, I think, which I think takes away a lot of the agency that the woman otherwise has. Though I did a little count up. There are 4 young women in the film, isn't it? One of them, the main one, is a sex worker, and then the others are defined as a sexual assault survivor. Mm-hmm. There's a jealous second in command, and then there's a woman who's been stealing from her boss. That's what this film thinks about young women, basically. Yeah. Margot could easily have just been Tyler's new girlfriend. Or maybe she could be the girlfriend that he's hoping to break up with, and this is the dinner that he's going to tell her about how it's over between them. She could have been someone who used to be a waitress, and so she has worked on the other side of that divide between the kitchen and the dining room. There's lots of possibilities. Sex worker is not the best solution to this problem.
Okay. I accept, but I think I have a theory on this, and I will start by saying I thought she was going to be a waitress or waiter as well, because he talked about her. Chef said, "Are you in the industry?" I think it's kind of this loose language of, okay, what industry are we talking about? But I assumed that she'd been a restaurant worker in some capacity. But when you think of horror films, I think this is a cliche built on another cliche. I think the general cliche in horror films is that the people who have sex are the first ones to get killed, right? And it's as if horror filmmakers are encouraging teen abstinence or something like that, because it's inevitable that if there's a teen couple that ends up having sex, they're like the first ones who go. And I think this reverses the myth in the sense that she's a sex worker and she ends up with the best outcome of all the characters. So that's maybe stretching it a little bit, pulling at strings, but I think it sort of reverses the general sex myth in horror films. But I do agree with you. I think there are millions of other professions she could have had, and probably had more believably, because a lot of her characteristics don't really fall in with what we consider the stereotypical sex worker qualities. But my wife had pointed out that her dress was shabbier than the others, so there was this definitely a sense of clothing, and again, that was a detail that I barely caught. But if you look at the dress of everyone else, I mean, the people in the dining room are dressed very, very well. And she's just a little dressed down, and I think that makes a big difference. But yeah, I think she could have been any other job holder. I mean, it was basically this idea that she was a giver. That was the other thing that he was playing. He was playing the takers against the givers, and he recognized in her a giver.
I wonder whether it just reflects the proportion of young women who people who are high up in Hollywood meet, who turn out to be sex workers, because this is the way that Hollywood views young women. I do have one other charge that I would like the Cliche Squad to look into, which is the use of a sudden, unexpected, dramatic suicide as a plot device. Again, which I kind of feel I have seen a little bit too often. You're building up to something a little bit unpleasant, and there's a bit of a build up. Oh, and then somebody produces a gun and blows their brains out. And again, it feels like a little bit of an easy story beat, which I've seen just a little bit too often now. I find those things, those kind of events, grotesque and disturbing, and I always have to look away from the screen. I find it very, very unpleasant to watch.
Yeah,
and it strikes me as it's a kind of a plot point of last resort. And again, there could be like a slightly cleverer, shocking event that could help turn the corner here, rather than using this same one that we've seen so many times.
Yeah,
the whole film to me, it's been photographed beautifully, great cast who do very well with the material they're given. But I personally feel could have had another couple of drafts, could have tied the whole thing together just a little bit more tightly. It doesn't quite hang together, and I don't think there's any good reason why it couldn't hang together. I think a little bit more attention, and it could have been really, really special. Whereas there are several points in the film where it feels a little bit, will this do to me? And I'm sorry to say that, because I don't want to be down on it. It's actually an interesting film, and I think it does have something to say. And it's a lot of very talented people behind it, and I don't want to kind of be a downer, but it's my job to be the naysayer this week.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I will be the yay-sayer. I think I loved it. I thought you probably have a good point that it could have been better. I think it's just a couple things short of being sort of masterpiece, because the actual creation, the filmmaking, the production is all fantastic. So you're right, it's a little shy on story, and it could have been cleaned up. I wonder if it was kind of a rush job, given everyone's work on television and other things going on. And the fact that probably a short shooting schedule also, because it's not, again, there's not a lot of locations, or not too many sets to design. What they do have is designed beautifully. But
so I suspect it was a pandemic shoot as well, I guess, wasn't it?
Probably, yeah, sort of in there somewhere. I mean, it would have been probably 2021 at some point. So, yeah, I think that's affected a lot of the films we've seen recently. And I will also say that even if it's not like A+ material, I think it's one of the best films I saw in 2022. So I'm going to say it's one of the best films of the year, even if it wasn't fully written. So I think you probably have a good point that it could have life, does have life as a piece of theater or musical. But I really do think it was a standout film for the year. And yeah, I definitely am not a horror film, but I don't really consider this anything more than black humor. It definitely has horror elements, and I think it plays that genre pretty well without really buying into all of its trappings. So I'm going to say it's a great film. Of course, it could have been a little bit better, and I wish it had been, but I'm going to take it as it is, and I will say yay. So we've got nays and yays here today.
Good nays and yays. I tell you what, if you see Mark Millard, tell him that we are available to do rewrites on the musical version. So we'll tidy up those loose ends. Okay, let's have a break, and then we will come back for our second course, our entree. Do you think? I don't know. Or maybe this is the dessert, the sweet food to follow on. We're going to come back, and we will talk about Babette's feast.
The world is getting crazier every year and every day.
Can't argue with that.
Yeah, that's just a fact of life. And I'm going to go across the decades. Recently, we've seen Dr. Gower taste poison to confirm that it was poison in It's a Wonderful Life. Do you remember that?
I do. Yes.
And then that was 2 podcasts ago. Last podcast, we saw Dr. Lindsay Brigman taste seawater to confirm that it was seawater in the abyss.
That's how science works, man. You can't deny that.
And once, Jimmy, I was on a bus in Ecuador when the fare collector, sort of like the chauffeur of the bus or conductor, tore a corner off of my $5 US bill to determine whether it was counterfeit by tasting it.
Oh!
I kid you not. Imagine my surprise when he spat it out, claimed it was a fake, and then kept it for himself. So you can understand why I'm happy to introduce to our listeners our newest sponsor, Kleptocurrency. Jimmy, I don't need to explain to you or our listeners how our financial lives are getting more and more complicated. Inflation on the rise, stock market volatility, retirement accounts subject to considerable loss of value, wage stagnation, low interest rates on the most basic savings accounts, roller coaster real estate markets, the government, every government always wants more of your hard-earned cash. What should we do with our money? How should we invest? That's where Kleptocurrency comes in. Simply put, we make money disappear. To a realm you can or might be able to access later. Gone are the days of monies and mattresses or the dirty old times of laundering money through shell companies and businesses. No more Swiss and Bahamian middlemen, bankers skimming off the top. No more clumsy coinage to carry around. No more paper money ripping and tearing. Paper money? Think about that for a moment. A scrap of paper could represent the difference between great poverty and great wealth. Gone are the days of this antiquated conception of value. No more tasting of that dirty paper money to evaluate its veracity. At Kleptocurrency, we don't use paper, and we can't be authenticated in any way. We use highly secured, triple encrypted algorithms to take your money and store it in our airtight servers that are so hard to compromise because they are hidden all around the world. They're so secret that even we don't know where to find them. There's no compromising security with Kleptocurrency. It's safe and better gone than never. And the best part is you can do all your banking investing with us from any electronic device. Really, any electronic device. Use your BlackBerry, Xbox, electric toothbrush, or your iPod. We don't care. We'll take your money any way you can lose it to us. No handshakes with your friendly local banker during these times of pandemic and contagion. No unnecessary knowledge of where your money is or who controls it. Just visit us at kleptocurrency.com.mit.a.crime this week. That's kleptocurrency.commit-a-crime. But for your security, we migrate our websites often, so you may be notified of some location changes for your peace of mind. Digital investment is no longer just for fools. We can all be soon parted from our money. Kleptocurrency. We're the Moseses of the parting of the currencies. Welcome back, everyone. We are headed into another tasting room of cinema. We're going to talk about Babette's Feast, or Babette's Gästebud, from 1987. And
I had to get you to introduce that because I can't say that. Gästebud. I can't. No.
I'm not sure I can say it either.
I know when I'm beaten.
Gästebud. I like saying it.
No, you'd seen this before, hadn't you? I had never seen this.
That's right. Well, this came up on a popcorn counter a long time ago when we talked about food. And I remembered that you hadn't seen it, so that's why I suggested it for this podcast. I've seen it at least. This would have been at least the third time, probably fourth. And it's a little bit like my Bergman thing, where I saw a lot of Bergman when I was in my 20s, and then I came back to it in my probably mid-30s, and then have come back to it again. So I've seen it in probably at least 3 or 4 different decades. So I love it. Yep.
I was just going. I'm glad I'm catching up with you. Okay, let me tell you the story then. Okay. So, Babette's Feast takes place in 19th century Jutland. This is the coast of Denmark. When I didn't even know that it was called Jutland, and I was wondering, is that where the word jut comes from? Because it's the bit of Denmark that juts out into the North Sea. But I looked it up, and it's not. Oh. So Jutland, it's a cold, wet, barely hospitable place. Mm-hmm. And two elderly spinsters, Martine and Philippa, are the last spiritual leaders of a tiny Lutheran sect there. About a dozen devotees remain. They're all in their 70s. They meet in their houses, nestled in the bleak landscape, and they sing songs of devotion and they discuss scripture. But many, many years before this, like 49 years previously, the two sisters were beautiful young women. Martine was courted by a visiting soldier, Lorenz Löwenhelm. Philippa was adored by a fated Parisian singer called Achille Papin, who visited the small town. Neither of them married. Instead, their father kept them single so that they could stay by him to help him in his religious work. And now, 50 years later, they struggled to make ends meet until Babette, a French woman who has escaped the Communard uprising in Paris, arrives at their door. She has lost everything, and she is so desperate that she offers to work for the two sisters for free. So the three women, they settle into a life together in this cold, wet Danish landscape until, finally, after many more years, Babette wins a great sum of money. So, in thanks for the kindness that she's been shown, she promises to create for the sisters and for the faithful a French banquet unlike anything they have ever seen or eaten. And this is Babette's feast. So the film was directed and written by Gabriel Axel. So he's a Danish television comedy director. He did a lot of French TV shortly before this film. This is by far the most significant and well-known film he made. After this was a hit, 'cause it won the Oscar, didn't it, for non-English language film?
Yeah.
And so he then went on to work in Hollywood briefly. He made a film called Prince of Jutland with Gabriel Byrne and Christian Bale, but not a great deal more came of his career. He wasn't young at the time this film was made. The film is based on a short story by Karen Blixen, publishing under the name of Isaac Dinesen. She had also written Out of Africa, which had been a film, I think, the year before this was released, I think 86. That was a Meryl Streep film. Yeah. The book was published in 1958, and true to the principles of the Two Book Cinema Club, I've read the book this week as well. So I read the short story this week. It's only about 60 pages long. And I'll simply tell you that the story is very, very, very like the film.
Yeah.
The book is just the same.
Yeah.
So much so that, I mean, even a lot of the same dialogue. The film uses one of my least favourite narrative devices, which is a narrator. And even the narrator, I think, isn't really part of the film. I was asking myself towards the end of the film, well, wait a second, who is that narrator? I think the narrator is supposed to be Karen Blixen. It's not narrated by a character in the film. It's an omniscient, overlooking narrator who sees the world with an all-seeing eye. Yeah. The film is populated by actors from some of Europe's greatest directors. So Ingmar Bergman, some of his crew turn up in this film. Yeah. Carl Dreyer, some of his actors turn up in this film. Yeah. So it's a kind of 20th century European cinema's greatest hits of these older actors playing these quite small parts. Bibi Andersson turns up. This kind of tiny role where she has like sort of 3 lines.
Does she have a line? She maybe, very little, very little. So she dances.
She's this kind of she's this worldly lady who suggests to Lorenz Löwenstein that he should go and visit Jutland.
Yeah.
I say, no, it's to Papin, isn't it? She suggests to the French singer, why don't you go and visit Jutland? It's a lovely place up there. I mean, so she's barely in it. It was like a half-day shoot or something like that.
Well, she dances with Lorenz at some ball, and I think she's always telling people to go talk to other people. It's this sort of networking role where I think she says, that's the prince over there, or the prime minister, go talk to him when they're dancing in a ballroom somewhere. So it's a very minor role, but she is credited, and I remember seeing her name in the credits, and I thought, okay, where is she? And that's her entire role.
And I got to say, I'm pleased to say, after we've clashed over the menu, I think this film is pretty much perfect.
Yeah,
I had such a great time watching it. It's a really restrained film. None of the histrionics of the menu. It's a restrained portrait of restrained people, and it's kind of it's all about the way that they sort of subsume their passions.
Yeah.
And best of all, for you and me, for the screenwriter, one of the many joys of this film is that so much of the story is told with looks and glances.
Yeah.
The dialogue is, often fairly minimal. It's not necessarily to the point. It's been, economically written, and a lot of the story is just told through people's eyes and the way that they look at the food or each other. Now, I don't like using the word perfect. I don't think the film is entirely faultless. And there is a little bit of exposition. And one thing that kind of stands out is there is a scene where Babette explains to the local shopkeeper, she says, my only connection to France is a lottery ticket, which a friend renews for me annually. And it's like, we saw Chekhov's boning knife in the first half, and this is Chekhov's lottery ticket now. The moment she mentions that, it's no surprise, well, that's blooming coming back, isn't it?
Yeah.
That is the only unsubtle moment in an otherwise very understated, subtle movie.
Yeah.
Seeing it again this time round, did you enjoy it just as much as before?
I did, yeah. Sometimes I'm embarrassed to admit how much I like this film. It's just, it's definitely not an action film or anything like that. But I kept up with the Ruzicas in the sense that I read the short story as well.
Oh, well done!
You're the reader here, and it's very loyal to it's a great short story. I like the short story as well. But the film is very loyal to that. As you said, some of the dialogue comes right out of there, and I think you've got a good point that the narrator is probably Dennison as well, or a Dennison-like character. But it sort of proves that I think short stories are better fodder for feature-length films than full novels are. It's manageable, and as you said, I think it's probably on the order. The version I read was probably about 50 or 60 pages long. It's just less material to cover. It's a very sparse film. It's a fairly sparse story as well. But I think it does everything really, really well, and it does things that I think in other films would not work so well. It does them well. I liked it a lot.
It's sparse, but at no point was I ever bored.
Yeah, definitely not. And again, the length is perfect. I think it was about the same thing. It was maybe an hour and 50 minutes or something like that, maybe even a little less than that. So it's not trying to be an epic by any means. And it starts out with almost immediately this exposition from that narrator, giving the backstories on the Philippa and Martine, and these potential lovers, and you're thinking, why are we getting all this information? But those two characters, even though they're secondary or tertiary, they end up being very important to getting Babette to them, and also getting to Babette's backstory and really seeing who she is. Because even though she lives with them for 12 years, they don't know Babette very well until the feast. So looking at it a bit more critically this time, I thought, okay, why are we getting into all this backstory in their lives? And it's actually probably not that long. It might be a 20-minute dive into their past lives. But it does all pay off, and it's sort of, the two potential lovers are not really sympathetic characters when they initially interact with the sisters, but they both get redemption sort of at the end. They really have this sort of this value in their lives, because there's not a lot of there are not a lot of people coming in intermingling with this very, very sort of remote town and its community there. So these two, the Paris opera singer and in Achille Papin, and the soldier who becomes general, are really kind of major guests, as far as we can tell, passing through, major visitors in the entire history of that village. So.
I did look at the timings, actually, when I was watching the film, and that first act. Yeah. So if you imagine that the first act is, that little bit of backstory of the lives of the women when they were young, and the visits of the two kind of suitors, that's pretty much exactly 30 minutes. I think Babette arrives at about the 30-minute mark. And then the final, like the third act, which is basically the dinner. The dinner, yeah. That's like the final 35 minutes of the film. So it's very, very rigidly structured. You have like a half-hour first act, 35-minute third act, and like a sort of 45-minute second act, with a very clear kind of midpoint, which is, which I would put the midpoint as the moment when the ingredients start arriving for the feast. I think
somewhere around that, like either the lottery ticket becoming real, and they're counting the money, and then getting the ingredients. One thing wrote down a little question mark on. I don't know if there's really an antagonist in this film. What would you consider the antagonist in Babette's Feast?
I think the antagonist in the film is regret.
Okay.
It's such a sort of a beautiful film. And I was there's especially a couple of scenes that I found extremely moving. I had like a tear in my eye. One of them is when like the elderly general,
Yeah.
so Lawrence is an old man now.
Yeah.
He tells Martine that even though he hasn't seen her for 50 years, whatever.
Yeah.
He says that he tells her that he's been with her every day since he saw her, and he will be with her for every day that remains. And it's such a kind of a sweet thing, and it's just this. There's this little sudden wave of, what might have been.
Yeah.
And it's like a moment of regret, and a kind of reflection of, did I make the right choices? I think that's the antagonism. In the same way that the other thing, there's some scene which happens very shortly after that, which I also found moving. I don't know whether I had something in my eye at this point of the film, then, because I couldn't get the tears back during this kind of 15-minute sequence. But after they've all had the dinner, and all the kind of the elderly parishioners, they leave, and they're all kind of in their 70s. They're all kind of really old and a bit doddery, and they leave the dinner, and they all stand around the well at the center of this tiny village, and they hold hands.
Yeah.
And it's like they're all elderly, but they're all kind of like primary age school children again as well. It's this really sort of beautiful image of friends kind of aging together, and sort of washing away their petty disagreements in the water from the well or the wine that they have just drunk.
Yeah.
And instead, they have this kind of perspective of what they really value and what's really important.
I think they've also all had this sort of jolt of something very, very different in the sense that I think it's a very sober society. So they're drinking this fantastic wine. They're eating these, if we've seen their diets, their day-to-day diets of bread and ale soup and just endless fish stews. And this is a very, very different meal. And I just imagine them as being buzzed. You can actually sort of feel them having this wonderful buzz or this inebriation that really brings such joy. And it's just the power of her food, I think. But also it's just one powerful moment that they share together. And in the book, in the short story, there's this one line that I love that I don't think was in the film. It's she writes, "They have been given 1 hour of the millennium." I love that line. And, the stars are out. The book has snow, I think, a lot more. I shouldn't say book. The story has a lot more snow in it. And it's intentionally, there's no snow in the film until the very end. But it really is just this beautiful moment. And I think when you talked about regret very well, I thought, I think that's the kind of thing is there's just little moments that got by some of the characters and they're wondering, what would have been. But in that moment where they're just dancing around the well and it's just beautiful. The ladies are holding candles outside and everyone's dancing and the stars are super bright. It's just that I really got that sense of, this is a night that they will always remember. And this is a moment that no one's going to regret. Like he's leaving. General Lawrence is leaving there somehow without regret. He seems very happy at that point, and he was, I think, also just to have this closure with Martine about, him being or her presence in his life until the day he dies. I think that was just great.
If you had to boil down the theme of the film, if you were to explain to somebody, what it was trying to say, how would you phrase it? What do you think it's about?
I think to a certain extent it's about art, and I think there's a connection to the menu in here too. It's just like Babette, and having read the short story really kind of helps a little bit because I think Babette sees herself as just an artist, a fantastic artist, and she will give up her lottery winnings to create one meal, because her second best is never good enough. She talks about that. So it's this idea of even if it's just one moment and one work of art, you've got to be the artist that you are inside, and it's all told within this very austere society of no one really standing out, no one shining. There's Philip is a great singer. And that's why Achille Pepin, the opera singer, is really there's this wonderful scene where he's teaching her a song, and it's a seductive thing from a Mozart opera, and it's at a time when like early going in the film where Philippa and Martine's father is still alive, and they're just these wonderful juxtapositions. I think there could have been more, but it's Martine and the father are listening in one room, and there's this seduction scene being sung by two fantastic voices in the next, and eyes are rolling, and it seems very inappropriate, but it really underlines how wonderful a singer Philippa was or is, and that she could have been an opera star, and she's an artist at heart. And the last moment, I think that Philippa borrows from Papena. He says this in the book. I'm not sure that he says it in the film. Well, she definitely says it to Babette in the film, where it's really the climax moment, and she's talking about Babette's maybe discussing her regrets, and she had no control over war and violence breaking out in France and ending her career as an artist. But she's just adamant, I'm a great artist. And at the end, Philippa's saying, you will enchant the angels. In heaven, you will enchant the angels. And it's something that I think Papin said as well. So for me, it's about artistry to a great extent. I think there's some other great themes in there, but for me, that was the biggest one that I took away. And the one that connects, I think, with the menu on some level is that these chefs are great artists, and they need to be honored for their work, I guess.
I did read that the film is a favourite of a lot of religious leaders. That the Archbishop of Canterbury kind of has said, really? "Oh, I love this film," and the Pope kind of loves this film. But the kind of the message that I took away actually was a largely materialist one. I think. Mm-hmm. I think, although the community in the film is a religious one, I think the message of the film is that the soul and the body are the same thing. Mm-hmm. That when you feed the body, you feed the soul, because they're not just connected; they're the same thing, really. Yeah. In the same way that when the elderly parishioners are gathered around the well, you can see that the elderly people contain the young people that they used to be. That they're the same. Yeah. The kind of the buzz they've got from the wine, which has caused them to kind of open their hearts. It seems like a materialist view of a spiritual community. All things are connected because all things are the same. I think it's just a beautiful film, but not just beautiful. It's funny as well.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, I think it's a comedy. I probably laughed more. It's possible I laughed more in this film than I did in the menu. And I think the comic moments are great, and it's hard to you couldn't bill it, you couldn't sell it as a comedy, but there are definitely some very lovely, witty moments, and some juxtapositions that are great. There's this one where the sisters are talking to the parishioners. They're really worried about this crazy, perhaps diabolical meal that Babette is going to serve, and they just get the parishioners to sort of all agree that they're not going to complain about the food or make any comments. And then they're doing this with there's an image of Christ on the wall, and it cuts directly to this wheelbarrow full of a cow's head and blood and guts and entrails, and it's just fantastic. And it's the kind of thing that just makes me laugh because it was just very well designed as a cut.
I wrote in my notes here just while I was watching the film. I've written, I am laughing for joy. This is the greatest restaurant ever. I think it's tricky to really portray food properly on screen because food is so much about. I know people laugh and sneer at this notion of mouthfeel, which comes up in the menu, but the information that you get from food has so much more to do with texture and smell and so many parameters that you can't convey through cinema. So really saying something profound about food with cinema should be a bit of a non-starter because these are barely connected worlds, and yet I did leave both of these films feeling half like I had enjoyed a sumptuous meal.
There's some other sort of themes that I did think came out. So you're mentioning materialism. For me, there was such simplicity in the lives of the followers of the pastor, and it seemed like a very, very austere society. And it contrasts with me a lot. Like we're in a day and age where like the most likes on social media or notoriety at all costs are really important. I mean, the notion of people like electing to live and die simply and just modestly, but as excellent people, it's kind of foreign. It's just as foreign as incomprehensible to us as like a subtitled Danish art film from the mid-1980s. It's out of place. These are sort of values and themes that seem way out of place. But for me, that's what it was. Just the excellence of simplicity, that tiny little village, and showing that just these artists passing through it. I thought that was very interesting. Contrast as well. So for me, I think it kind of continues on that artistry level, but just the simple life being celebrated. I thought that was definitely a theme in there as well.
Well, before we kind of try and tie these two films together, I'll kind of try and do a bit of a synthesis.
Yeah.
Let's quickly play our new game, blatantly stolen from another podcast. Who am I?
Oh.
Who am I?
So. The reason we go to the movies is to see ourselves, but ourselves made different. I don't know, that's my theory. Having watched these two films, did you see yourself on screen this week in either of them?
I answered first last time, so I'm going to pass the question right back to you.
Yeah.
You're talking about both films, The Menu or Babette's Feast, yeah. I
didn't feel very much like any of the characters in The Menu. Maybe I'm flattering myself. But I tell you who I really recognised was the coachman in Babette's Feast. So when the general and his aunt turn up to this meal, they're brought by a coachman, and the coachman then he sits in the kitchen, and and he sort of eats the dishes before they go out into the main dining room. And he gets to enjoy the wine, and he does a tiny bit of work by grinding the coffee, but otherwise basically he just kind of enjoys this food for free. And then at the very end of the evening, Babette tells him thanks for your help, and he says you're welcome as he leaves. That guy's got my role in the kitchen absolutely down pat. That is me to a T.
Good choice. Very good choice. I'm going to point to a character in each film, but for probably similar reasons. I'm going to say John Leguizamo, who plays this remorseful actor.
Oh, you're doing yourself, Dan. You are not like that guy.
And Achille Papin, I think the opera singer, too. I love these artists who just have regrets, very human, I think. And I love the John Leguizamo. The film that the chef hates is called Calling Dr. Sunshine, I think. Which sounds so terrible. And I could just see, artistically making some poor choices. I think I could respect that and just having those regrets. So those are my two characters. I love the opera singer is fantastic. And that scene where there's this seduction in the drawing room where the piano is just so good. And it's so funny, too. I just love that. I think it was one of the funnier scenes where eyes are turning in the next room and they're just imagining what's going on in the rehearsal. It's just fantastic. So I'm going to say, Leguizamo and Achille Papin.
God, that Mozart scene, actually, it's so beautifully acted, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because the daughter in that scene, she's very, very nearly charmed by him, isn't she?
Yeah.
She very nearly tips over the edge, and then she kind of reins it back in. But it's all just done, with her eyes and her kind of face. It's just beautifully done. It's so lovely.
There's another scene that really sticks with me that I'd like to talk about a little bit. Because it's the way that Babette is introduced to us. She comes in this storm. She herself is kind of a storm. She's just a mess of wet clothes and wet hair and chilled body. And she arrives in this storm, and you get the exposition. I thought it was really quite clever. It's a letter from Papin to the sisters to introduce Babette to them. And it really struck me for a number of reasons. I thought it was actually done quite elegantly for an exposition scene, but in part it had to do with the language, I think. The letters is in French. So these Danish sisters are reading the letter to find out about Babette, and I think obviously to get the audience up to date on Babette's story. But there are these wonderful turns of the ladies putting on their glasses, and then they read in French. So these are Danish characters reading in French, and you don't see this in film. People don't write letters anymore. People don't read anymore, and you don't really have that many polyglots in film. So it really made me think it's a lovely scene because you're also getting Babette's story. She can't speak a word of Danish at this point. And I just thought, it got me thinking about comparing to someone today using Google Translate to understand some semi-literate text message. And I just thought, Alexa, please read this letter. Sure. In what language? 1870s French with a Danish accent, please. Sure, here you are. I mean, it's just a scene that you can't happen in American cinema and just doesn't happen very often in any cinema anymore. And it just really, just a mundane scene, but it was filmed wonderfully, it was acted wonderfully, and the whole setup was just fantastic. And I don't see scenes like that anymore. I don't know if we're going to. And I know we're going to do a popcorn counter probably on cell phones eventually. And I just think these are things that technology has changed. You can't have that. I mean, obviously, if you set it in the 1870s as this film is set, then it makes sense. But it was just a wonderful moment.
I did love the moment when Papin, the singer, turns up at the house to suggest that he teach Philippa how to sing. And he does that wonderful 19th century thing of he presents the father with a little calling card.
Yeah.
The only thing written on the calling card is his name. But my God, I wish people still did that, because the number of times I've met someone new and then forgotten their name 15 seconds after meeting them. Yeah. Could everybody please just hand out a little card with your name written on? That is a useful, utilitarian bit of cardboard that we should bring back.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
Agreed, yeah.
So what... Can we bring these films together? Do they belong together? Is it a good double bill, this too?
I think it is. I think there's a fantastic celebration of food in both. I mean, I can't deny the culinary artistry of the menu, and it's totally on display. I mean, you really see Babette cooking stuff, and on like antiquated stoves and things like that. But she's creating with such joy, and the actress looks like a fantastic chef in there. So I think there's definitely, on the food level, it's very obvious. I think, yes, on the subtle themes of class and simplicity versus complexity, and who we consider the more civilized, maybe a famous opera singer or a general versus just common folk. I think there's a lot going on in both films, and I think the famous people or the well-to-do people in Babette's Feast are not worshipped in the way that I think in that film there's more worship of this simple life, and Babette, she really achieves some of her notoriety when she's not famous as a chef. I mean, the way that the simple villagers love her food, and when she's gone for a few days, it's a step down in gourmet eating. So I think they are celebrated more than the kitchen staff. And I come back to that kitchen staff in the menu, because that's the hardest part for me of that film, is just seeing how obsequious, I guess, they are in regards to the chef, and just accepting their fate. So I think there are ways to connect it.
But the thing that struck me was there's this comment that Tyler makes really early on in the menu, which is so applicable to Babette's Feast, where he says that chefs, make food using the same raw materials that God uses to make life.
Yeah,
and that's absolutely what kind of Babette's Feast is about. Somehow she's using like a cow's head and a turtle to make. Like this kind of spiritual religious experience. It's absolutely, it's food doing the work of God. Yeah. There's a really kind of explicit connection between food and eternity. Yep. In both films.
And entrapment too, when you think about it. I mean, the flock that follows the pastor, they're just as trapped in that small town, and more so in the little yellow house, as it's mentioned in the short story. You've got a captive audience. It's probably the same number of diners too, if you really look at it. It's one of these situations where I think I counted 11 in the menu, and I think there are 12 because the general shows up as an unannounced guest, another unannounced guest. I mean, it's another one of these situations where it's impossible to believe that the writers of the menu hadn't seen Babette's Feast.
Yeah. The thing I've written in my notes here is that in the menu, the food is used as a way to separate people, isn't it? It's about this line between the kitchen and the dining room. There's the haves and the have-nots. There's the servers and the served. Yeah. There is the initiated who know about food, and the ignorant who do not. Yeah. And also there are the survivors and the dead. It's all about separating people and drawing lines. Whereas Babette's Feast is it's like the opposite. Well, so we said earlier that the menu is a foodie film about late-stage capitalism. Yeah. And Babette's Feast is a foodie film about liberty, fraternity, and equality, I think. Yeah. At the end of the menu, basically everyone dies. Whereas at the end of Babette's Feast, people are born again.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, at the end of Babette's Feast, all of the characters have recognised their mortality. So they have. I think they have seen death, but they're okay with it. They are kind of born again, aren't they?
Yeah, well, I mean, I love that because chef says in the menu, we're all going to die tonight. And to a certain extent, in Babette's Feast, the same thing happens. Maybe these old grudges are buried among certain characters, and they're almost born again. You mentioned that scene around the well, and they're dancing as children. And there's a line about that earlier about that children love one another. I think that's something that the pastor said. So they've gone back to this point of love and sort of youth, and certain parts of their pasts have died. And we're talking about regrets and remorse. That's gone. So there is a death that creates new life, and that's optimistic in Babette's Feast, and it's very pessimistic, I think, in the menu. But they go together well. I
wrote down this little catchphrase they keep coming up with in Babette's Feast, which is mercy and truth shall know one another.
Yeah.
And there's lots of mercy and truth in Babette's Feast, and there's very little of it in the menu. Well, man, what a great pairing. We have just got time to talk about also playing at this theatre. So I went first with Who Am I? Your turn to go first this time. What else have you seen lately?
I've been on something of a documentary binge, I guess. So I saw, and I'm trying to remember the title exactly, I think it's called This House Rocks, which is a look into the events of January 6, 2021 here in the United States, down in Washington, D.C. It's sort of the setup for it all and sort of an examination of some of the troublemakers there. So that was on one of the streamers, probably Netflix. And then on public television here, we have a documentary filmmaker you may have heard of named Ken Burns. He's done a lot of big documentaries on, Benjamin Franklin. Yeah.
I've mostly heard of him because in the Apple software to make iMovie like videos, you have a button for the Ken Burns effect. That's the only time I'd ever heard of Ken Burns, but now I understand.
He's a really good documentary filmmaker. He's one of these guys who, like the old master painters, had a studio where you've probably got 12 people doing most of the work, and he's just overseeing it because he cranks out documentaries, and I think they all sort of automatically go to PBS. And he had a documentary series in the fall called The U.S. and the Holocaust. So I've been watching that. I think I'm about halfway through. There are 3 longish episodes of 2+ hours. And it's a really honest look at, and it's a frighteningly honest look at really how the Nazis and Hitler borrowed from a lot of things that they'd learned from American history and American actions to really initiate and execute the entire Holocaust. It's and taking over the German Republic. So, it's good. I mean, I haven't finished it yet, but I think there's a lot of fantastic work going on in there because he's using old archival film footage and making it look good. I think a lot of the work just goes into just taking, but there's a lot of stuff, a lot more live film of Hitler than I ever imagined, and it's just the restoration that goes into his documentaries is very impressive, but also just how it's all pieced together. And so that's what I've been watching lately. Nothing really uplifting. Please tell me you've got optimistic romantic comedies and things for me to hear about.
Well, we aimed for optimistic and we made a terrible, terrible mistake. So also playing at our theatre last Saturday, we gathered around for a bit of family telly, ordered a pizza, and we watched Adventures in Babysitting, also from 1987.
Wow.
But actually quite different to Babette's Feast. I'd never seen it, and it's Elizabeth Shue. I think it was Buena Vista, which was like the sort of the slightly more grown-up arm of Disney.
Oh, yeah.
And we kind of thought, this will be a reasonable family film. I never saw this. It's probably good fun. Elizabeth Shue had just recently been in Back to the Future Part 2, and it came with a pedigree. But oh my goodness me, it is shockingly dreadful. It's just about functional as a story, but there's all this kind of weird 80s sex stuff.
Yeah.
Which is, oh my God. Yes, it's, sex stuff. And then also kind of, weird, uncomfortable racism and, yes, all sorts of terrible, terrible things to ruin our family evenings viewing. So, I mean, I did laugh. There were a few gags and some chuckles, but did leave me feeling, dirty and confused and having a lot to explain to my son. So
who chooses the films in your household?
Well, not me in future. I think I've lost that job.
Oh, no.
Yeah, bad programming. Yeah, absolutely. Well, okay. So, this has been a delicious.
Oh, good touch. Yeah,
delicious experience.
Tasty.
Thanks for. Yeah, you recommended these films, and I'm going to get you to recommend all the films now. I think, for the show and for my Saturday evening viewing as well.
Oh, yeah, maybe you need an intervention, that's for sure.
I need someone with taste to pick the films in my house. We will be back next week with a popcorn counter where we'll be laughing and joking about death. And then the week after that, we're going to be back talking about donkeys, aren't we? Is that right?
Asses, yes. If all goes well, we are going to see EO, which is a Polish film that just came out, I think, in 2022, and comparing that to O Hasard Baltazar from Robert Bresson from the maybe 50s, or is it maybe 60s?
It's donkey in this country. Yeah, it's definitely donkey.
They're both donkey films. That's all you need to know.
Thanks for listening, and join us next time. All the best.